So one of the hardest things about being an ESOL teacher, but the most necessary, is differentiating what you're giving to students. So this doesn't mean picking some newspaper article and sort of taking out some of the words. It oftentimes means making anywhere from 2 to 4 different versions of something. And it doesn't mean something completely different, but you have to think about what they can do at their level. So an example of this would be if you want students to learn about immigration, that's a really big topic for a newcomer student. So what I would do instead of giving them an article about immigration is I give them graphs, so pictures, images that they can read, and ask them to identify information in a graph. So who are the most people, what's the biggest population in the United States? And they can find the tallest bar graph, versus a higher level student who would then be reading a text about that same information. So it's the presentation of the information. The topic is the same, maybe the final goal is the same, but you have someone looking at the graphs of the content versus somebody reading the article about the content. And then it can also look like differentiating the final product. So there's like differentiation of your process, which is the most common thing that I do. I normally have a similar assessment goal for students, whether it's a small writing, but the final product, and in that sense, the final product would be supported with sentence. So we go from maybe multiple choice to sentence stems to free writing with multiple pieces of evidence up the scale.
Knowing when to differentiate is something that I don't think I will ever stop learning how to do. For me, it's one of the hardest parts. And I think that's probably just because you can always differentiate more. You can always be more precise and differentiate for more students down to the individual. It has been really helpful for me to start off with sort of a menu of differentiation in my head, if you will. So for example, when I was beginning as a teacher, I would often think in terms of, do kids need a sentence frame or a sentence starter or a paragraph frame or sentence starters to put into a paragraph, right? Like what level of discourse are they at? And then along with that, do they need a picture? If so, does the picture need to be with the word? Do they need to be paired together or not? And so there were these kind of like certain essential scaffolds that I kind of went through in my head, like what level are they at? Sentence frames, sentence starters, even paragraph frames, that kind of thing I use a lot. But in this particular lesson, I did a lot of differentiating. A lot of it was done on the fly, which is not to say that it wasn't thought out. It's things that I've done so many times that it comes somewhat naturally to me now. But for example, there were different pictures of different community helpers, and I was giving them to students one by one and then asking them to write a sentence about that. He is a construction worker. She is a tailor. They are teachers. So they have to know these nouns to name community helpers, and then they also have to know the pronouns he, she, they. And so as I had the little stack of pictures of community helpers in my hand, I gave the ones that I knew everyone knew to the kids that struggle the most and had them start with that because I want them to start off confident.
Okay, Marta, can you read it?
He is a police.
Con tu dedo. The?
Finish.
Officer. Ok, otra vez con tu dedo.
He is a police officer.
Good. Punto. Period.
In this particular lesson, there was a student that had some difficulty reading one of the sentences she wrote because she kept getting ahead of herself in what word she was looking at. And I could tell she wasn't matching the word she was seeing with the word in her head. She was just had memorized the sentence structure and then was trying to say it at the same time as looking at the words. So I had her use her finger and point to the words as she said them. That is certainly not something that I would ask every student to do. That is not something I would even want every student to do. Because if a student's reading level is good enough, I want them to practice reading without their finger.
So there are a lot of different ways that you could differentiate. The three that I tend to fall back on, I tend to use word banks. I tend to use a lot of sentence starters or sentence frames for various levels, and then incorporate visuals, kind of strategic use of visuals. So those are the three that I use the most often. I also, especially for more beginner or lower level, lower proficiency level students, before you even start an assignment, I tend to differentiate just the instructions themselves. A lot of times instructions are written in long sentences with multiple steps, so taking the instructions themselves and making sure that they're very simple sentences, short sentences with first, next, then, something like that, to make sure that the instructions are clear. For lower proficiency groups, I usually have a word bank that's smaller. I tend to focus on a fewer words and choose ones that are really high frequency, or will give you a lot of bang for your buck if you're going to focus on those ones. So being really strategic and picking out just the most essential words. So putting those into a word bank and incorporating a visual for each of those words in the word bank. I also, for my lower proficiency students, tend to give them a whole sentence frame, so they're not just a start for them to kind of finish open-ended, but an entire frame so that they really are just plugging in a couple of words and then they have a complete sentence to encourage that without it being too overwhelming because they're not sure how to finish. And then with my higher level students, I tend to also have a word bank, but maybe the words that are included are different. I would include those essential words, but then give them more and encourage them to use more of the words from the word banks in their responses. They may not need quite as many visuals, so maybe just the particularly confusing ones would come with a visual. And I tend to give them more sentence starters, where I'll help them get going, but then leave it more open-ended and hope that they can produce more of an original sentence.
We know that when we write paragraphs, what do we need first?
Introduction.
We need our introduction sentence first, so I'm going to put this. You don't have to write yet. So the first sentence that you're going to write is your introduction, because we have to tell the reader what they're going to be reading about. And then what do you think that we should do next for our next sentence, for our second sentence? Marjorie?
We have to do a new problem that we'll face.
So then maybe we'll say problem number 1. You pick a problem that he faced. And then I'm going to write prob 1. Okay? And then you're just going to talk about only the problems?
And the solution.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about problem 1. Then we're going to talk about solution 1. How many problems do you think we should talk about?
10.
10?
Yes.
Wow, that's going to be a long paragraph. Probably, usually like 3. Can we say 3 for this paragraph?
Yeah.
Okay. So problem 1 and then solution, and then what? Problem number?
Problem 2, solution
2. Okay. Solution 2. And then what?
Problem 3. Oh yeah.
We said 3, right?
Or
Problem 3 and solution 3. And then Angie, you're excited about, what do we call that last sentence? Wait, interactions are there. You said it.
Conclusion.
Yeah, then we're gonna have a conclusion, right? So this is gonna be a really nice, this is like a 4th or 5th grade paragraph because you're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sentences. So you're gonna have 1 sentence for each of these, right? You can write 8. You guys are really good writers, so I know that you can.
That's 9.
Yes, if you need to add more details, that would be great.